First Scene, Chapter 5 of No Name. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dylan Stiles. No Name by Wilkie Collins. First Scene, Chapter 5. Mr. Van Stone's inquiries into the proposed theatrical entertainment at Evergreen Lodge were answered by a narrative of dramatic disasters, of which Miss Marrable impersonated the innocent cause, and in which her father and mother played the parts of chief victims. Miss Marrable was that hardest of all born tyrants, an only child. She had never granted a constitutional privilege to her oppressed father and mother since the time when she cut her first tooth. Her 17th birthday was now near at hand. She had decided on celebrating it by acting a play, had issued her orders accordingly, and had been obeyed by her docile parents as implicitly as usual. Mrs. Marrable gave up the drawing-room to be laid waste for a stage and a theatre. Mr. Marrable secured the services of a respectable professional person to drill the young ladies and gentlemen, and to accept all the other responsibilities incidental to creating a dramatic world out of a domestic chaos. Having further accustomed themselves to the breaking of furniture and the staining of walls, to thumping, tumbling, hammering, and screaming, to doors always banging, and to footsteps perpetually running up and down the stairs, the nominal master and mistress of the house fondly believed that their chief troubles were over. Innocent and fatal delusion. It is one thing in private society to set up the stage and choose the play. It is another thing altogether to find the actors. Hitherto only a small preliminary annoyances proper to the occasion had shown themselves at Evergreen Lodge. The sound and serious troubles were all to come. The rivals having been chosen as the play, Miss Marrable, as a matter of course, had appropriated to herself the part of Lydia Languish, one of her favoured swains, next secured to Captain Absolute, and another laid violent hands on Sir Lucius O'Trigger. These two were followed by an accommodating spinster relative, who accepted the heavy dramatic responsibility of Miss Malaprop, and there the theatrical proceedings came to a pause. 9 more speaking characters were left to be fitted with representatives, and with that unavoidable necessity the serious troubles began. All the friends of the family suddenly became unreliable people, for the first time in their lives. After encouraging the idea of the play, they declined the personal sacrifice of acting in it, or they accepted characters and then broke down in the effort to study them. Or they volunteered to take the parts which they knew were already engaged, and declined the parts which were waiting to be acted. Or they were afflicted with weak constitutions, and mischievously fell ill when they were wanted at rehearsal. Or they had Puritan relatives in the background, and, after slipping into their parts, cheerfully at the week's beginning, oozed out of them penitently, under serious family pressure, at the week's end. Meanwhile the carpenters hammered and the scenes rose. Miss Marrable, whose temperament was sensitive, became hysterical under the strain of perpetual anxiety. The family doctor declined to answer for the nervous consequences if something was not done. Renewed efforts were made in every direction. Actors and actresses were sought with a desperate disregard of all considerations of personal fitness. Necessity, which knows no law either in the drama or out of it, accepted a lad of 18 as the representative of Sir Anthony Absolute, the stage manager undertaking to supply the necessary wrinkles from the imitable resources of theatrical art. A lady whose age was unknown, and whose personal appearance was stout, but whose heart was in the right place, volunteered to act the part of the sentimental Julia, and brought with her the dramatic qualification of habitually wearing a wig in private life. Thanks to these vigorous measures, the play was at last supplied with representatives, always excepting the two unmanageable characters of Lucy, the waiting-maid, and Falkland, Julia's jealous lover. Gentlemen came, saw Julia at rehearsal, observed her stoutness and her wig, omitted to notice that her heart was in the right place, quailed at the prospect, apologized, and retired. Ladies read the part of Lucy, remarked that she appeared to great advantage in the first half of the play, and faded out of it altogether in the latter half, objected to pass from the notice of the audience in that manner, when all the rest had a chance of distinguishing themselves to the end, shut up the book, apologized, and retired. In 8 days more, the night of the performance would arrive. A phalanx of social martyrs, 200 strong, had been convened to witness it. 3 full rehearsals were absolutely necessary, and 2 characters in the play were not yet filled. With this lamentable story, and with the humblest apologies for presuming on a slight acquaintance, the Marrables appeared at Combe Raven, to appeal to the young ladies for a Lucy, and to the universe for a Falkland, with the mendicant pertinacity of a family in despair. This statement of circumstances, addressed to an audience which included a father of Mr. Vanstone's disposition, and a daughter of Madeline's temperament, produced the result which might have been anticipated from the first. Either misinterpreting or disregarding the ominous silence preserved by his wife and Miss Garth, Mr. Vanstone not only gave Madeline permission to assist the forlorn dramatic company, but accepted an invitation to witness the performance for Nora and himself. Mrs. Vanstone declined accompanying them on account of her health, and Miss Garth only engaged to make one among the audience conditionally on not being wanted at home. The parts of Lucy and Falkland, which distressed late family carried about them everywhere like incidental maladies, were handed to their representatives on the spot. Frank's faint remonstrances were rejected without a hearing. The days and hours of rehearsal were carefully noted down on the covers of the parts, and the Marrables took their leave, with a perfect explosion of thanks, father, mother, and daughter sowing their expressions of gratitude broadcast, from the drawing-room door to the garden gates. As soon as the carriage had driven away, Madeline presented herself to the general observation under an entirely new aspect. "If any more visitors call to-day," she said, with the profoundest gravity of look and manner, "I am not home. This is a far more serious matter than any of you suppose. Go anywhere by yourself, Frank, and read over your part, and don't let your attention wander if you can possibly help it. I shall not be acceptable before the evening. If you will come here, with Papa's permission, after tea, my views on the subject of Falkland will be at your disposal. Thomas! Whatever else the gardener does, he is not to make any floricultural noises under my window. For the rest of the afternoon I shall be immersed in study, and the quieter the house is, the more obliged I shall feel to everybody." Before Miss Garth's battery of reproof could open fire, before the first outburst of Mr. Vanstone's hearty laughter could escape his lips, she bowed to them with imperturbable gravity, ascended the house steps, for the first time in her life, at a walk instead of a run, and retired then and there to the bedroom regions. Frank's helpless astonishment at her disappearance added a new element of absurdity to the scene. He stood first on one leg, and then on the other, rolling and unrolling his part, and looking piteously in the faces of the friends about him. "I know I can't do it," he said. "May I come in after tea, and hear Madeline's views? Thank you. I'll look in at about 8. Don't tell my father about this acting, please. I should never hear the last of it." Those were the only words he had spirit enough to utter. He drifted away aimlessly in the direction of the shrubbery, with the part hanging open in his hand. The most incapable of Falklands, and the most helpless of mankind. Frank's departure left the family by themselves, and was the signal accordingly for an attack on Mr. Vanstone's inveterate carelessness in the exercise of his paternal authority. "What could you possibly be thinking of, Andrew, when you gave your consent?" asked Mrs. Vanstone. "Surely my silence was a sufficient warning to you to say no." "A mistake, Mr. Vanstone," chimed in Miss Garth, "made with the best intentions, but a mistake for all that." "It may be a mistake," said Nora, taking her father's part as usual, "but I really don't see how Papa or anyone else could have declined, under the circumstances." "Quite right, my dear," observed Mr. Vanstone. "The circumstances, as you say, were dead against me. Here were these unfortunate people in a scrape on one side, and Madeline, on the other, mad to act. I couldn't say I had methodistical objections. I've nothing methodistical about me. What other excuse could I make? The Marrables are respectable people, and keep the best company in Clifton. What harm can she get in their house? If you come to prudence and that sort of thing, why shouldn't Madeline do what Miss Marrable does? There, there. Let the poor things act, and amuse themselves. We were their age once, and it's no use making a fuss, and that's all I've got to say about it." With that characteristic defence of his own conduct, Mr. Vanstone sauntered back to the greenhouse to smoke another cigar. "I didn't say so to Papa," said Nora, taking her mother's arm on the way back to the house, "but the bad result of the acting, in my opinion, will be the familiarity it is sure to encourage between Madeline and Francis Clare." "You are prejudiced against Frank, my love," said Mrs. Vanstone. Nora's soft, secret hazel eyes sank to the ground. She said no more. Her opinions were unchangeable, but she never disputed with anybody. She had the great failing of a reserved nature, the failing of obstinacy, and the great merit, the merit of silence. "What is your head running on now?" thought Miss Garth, casting a sharp look at Nora's dark, downcast face. "You're one of the impenetrable sort. Give me Madeline, with all her perversities. I can see daylight through her. You're as dark as night." The hours of the afternoon passed away, and still Madeline remained shut up in her own room. No restless footsteps pattered on the stairs. No nimble tongue was heard chattering here, there, and everywhere, from the garret to the kitchen. The house seemed hardly like itself, with the one ever-disturbing element in the family serenity suddenly withdrawn from it. Anxious to witness with her own eyes the reality of a transformation in which past experience still inclined her to disbelieve, Miss Garth ascended to Madeline's room, knocked twice at the door, received no answer, opened it, and looked in. There sat Madeline, in an armchair before the long looking-glass, with all her hair let down over her shoulders, absorbed in the study of her part, and comfortably arrayed in her morning wrapper, until it was time to dress for dinner. And there behind her sat the lady's maid, slowly combing out the long heavy locks of her young mistress's hair, with the sleepy resignation of a woman who had been engaged in that employment for some hours past. The sun was shining, and the green shutters outside the window were closed. The dim light fell tenderly on the two quiet-seated figures. On the little white bed, with knots of rose-colored ribbon which looped up its curtains, and the bright dress for dinner laid ready across it, on the gaily painted bath with its pure lining of white enamel, on the toilet table with its sparkling trinkets, its crystal bottles, its silver bell with Cupid for a handle, its litter of little luxuries that adorn the shrine of a woman's bedchamber. The luxurious tranquillity of the scene, the cool fragrance of flowers and perfumes in the atmosphere, the rapt attitude of Magdalen, absorbed over her reading, the monotonous regularity of movement in the maid's hand and arm, as she drew the comb smoothly through and through her mistress's hair. All conveyed the same soothing impression of drowsy, delicious quiet. On one side of the door were the broad daylight and the familiar realities of life. On the other was the dreamland of Elysian serenity, the sanctuary of unruffled repose. Miss Garth paused on the threshold, and looked into the room in silence. Magdalen's curious fancy for having her hair combed at all times and seasons was among the peculiarities of her character which were notorious to everybody in the house. It was one of her father's favorite jokes that she reminded him, on such occasions, of a cat having her back stroked, and that he always expected, if the combing were only continued long enough, to hear her purr. Extravagant as it may seem, the comparison was not altogether inappropriate. The girl's fervid temperament intensified the essentially feminine pleasure that most women feel in the passage of the comb through their hair, to a luxury of sensation which absorbed her in enjoyment, so serenely self-demonstrative, so drowsily deep, that it did irresistibly suggest a pet cat's enjoyment under a caressing hand. Intimately as Miss Garth was acquainted with this peculiarity in her pupil, she now saw it asserting itself for the first time in association with mental exertion of any kind on Magdalen's part. Feeling, therefore, some curiosity to know how long the combing and studying had gone on together, she ventured on putting the question, first to the mistress, and, receiving no answer in that quarter, secondly to the maid. "All the afternoon, miss, off and on," was the weary answer. "Miss Magdalen says it soothes her feelings and clears her mind." Knowing by experience that interference would be hopeless under these circumstances, Miss Garth turned sharply and left the room. She smiled when she was outside on the landing. The female mind does occasionally, though not often, project itself into the future. Miss Garth was prophetically pitying Magdalen's unfortunate husband. Dinner-time presented the fair student to the family eye in the same mentally absorbed aspect. On all ordinary occasions, Magdalen's appetite would have terrified those feeble sentimentalists who affect to ignore the all-important influence which female feeding exerts in the production of female beauty. On this occasion she refused one dish after another with a resolution which implied the rarest of all modern martyrdoms, gastric martyrdom. "I have conceived the part of Lucy," she observed with the demurest gravity. "The next difficulty is to make Frank conceive the part of Falkland. I see nothing to laugh at. You wouldn't all be serious enough if you had my responsibilities. No, papa, no wine today, thank you. I must keep my intelligence clear. Water, Thomas, and a little more jelly, I think, before you take it away." When Frank presented himself in the evening, ignorant of the first elements of his part, she took him in hand, as a middle-aged schoolmistress might have taken in hand a backward little boy. The few attempts he made to vary the sternly practical nature of the evening's occupation by slipping in compliments sidelong she put away from her with contemptuous self-possession of a woman of twice her age. She literally forced him into his part. Her father fell asleep in his chair. Mrs. Vanstone and Miss Garth lost their interest in the proceedings, retired to the further end of the room, and spoke together in whispers. It grew later and later, and still Magdalen never flinched from her task. Still, with equal perseverance, Nora, who had been on the watch all through the evening, kept on the watch to the end. The distrust darkened and darkened on her face as she looked at her sister and Frank, as she saw how closely they sat together, devoted to the same interest and working it to the same end. The clock on the mantelpiece pointed to 11:30 before Lucy the resolute permitted Falkland the helpless to shut up his task-book for the night. "She's wonderfully clever, isn't she?" said Frank, taking leave of Mr. Vanstone at the hall door. "I'm to come tomorrow and hear more of her views, if you have no objection." "I shall never do it. Don't tell her I said so. As fast as she teaches me one speech, the other goes out my head. Discouraging, isn't it? Good night." The next day was the day of the first full rehearsal. On the previous evening, Mrs. Vanstone's spirits had been sadly depressed. At a private interview with Miss Garth, she had referred again, of her own accord, to the subject of her letter from London, had spoken self-reproachfully of her weakness in admitting Captain Wragge's impudent claim to a family connection with her, and had then reverted to the state of her health and to the doubtful prospect that awaited her in the coming summer in a tone of despondency which it was very distressing to hear. Anxious to cheer her spirits, Miss Garth had changed the conversation as soon as possible, had referred to the approaching theatrical performance, and had relieved Mrs. Vanstone's mind of all anxiety in that direction, by announcing her intention of accompanying Magdalen to each rehearsal, and of not losing sight of her until she was safely back in her father's house. Accordingly, when Frank presented himself at Combe Raven on the eventful morning, there stood Miss Garth, prepared, in the interpolated character of Argus, to accompany Lucy and Falkland to the scene of trial. The railway conveyed the three in excellent time to Evergreen Lodge, and at 1 o'clock the rehearsal began. End of Chapter 5, First Scene.